The hook landed on me the way a bucket of ice water might. My roommate's mother pulled me into a hug at the front door, tears already streaking her face, and said, "I am so glad she finally found someone who makes her laugh again," and before I could correct her, before I could say a single word to explain that Wren and I were only roommates who split the rent on a two-bedroom apartment above a bakery, Wren squeezed my hand behind her mother's back and whispered into my ear, "Let's just let them keep thinking that. If stories about kindness, about people getting a second chance at love and family and belonging move something in you, I'd love for you to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you're here for the next story too." Our community grows because people like you believe that ordinary lives can hold extraordinary grace, and this story, more than most I've told, is about exactly that. My name is Grant Halloway, and 8 months before that front door moment, I was a 31-year-old man who had just signed a lease with a woman I barely knew because my old apartment building had been condemned after a burst pipe flooded 3 floors, and hers had a spare room and a listing on an app neither of us fully trusted. Wren Calloway answered the door the first day I came to see the place wearing paint-splattered overalls and holding a mug that said, "Not a morning person," in chipped lettering, and she looked me up and down with the kind of appraising squint you'd give a used car, and said, "You don't seem like a serial killer, but that's exactly what a serial killer would want me to think." I liked her immediately. There was no spark, no cinematic swell of music, nothing you'd call romantic, just an easy, unforced warmth, like finding out the stranger next to you on a long flight happens to be good company. We fell into a rhythm that surprised us both. Wren worked as a florist at a small shop downtown, arranging bouquets for weddings and funerals with equal tenderness, and she came home most evenings smelling of eucalyptus and rose stems, her fingers stained faintly green. I worked in software, the kind of job that let me work from the kitchen table most days, which meant I was usually home when she got back, usually had coffee already made, usually asked how her day had gone in a way that wasn't performative but just habitual, the way you ask about anyone whose life orbits close enough to yours to matter. We split chores. We watched terrible reality television together and narrated it like sports commentators. We never crossed the line into anything more, not because we didn't like each other, but because neither of us had ever really needed to ask the question. We were, simply and completely, friends who lived together, and it worked precisely because neither of us was trying to make it work into something else. What I didn't know for the first several months was the shape of the grief Wren carried quietly beneath all that easy warmth. It came out in pieces, the way real pain usually does, not in one dramatic confession, but in small admissions dropped into ordinary conversations. She mentioned once, while we were doing dishes, that her older brother had died 4 years earlier in a car accident on an icy road outside their hometown, and that her mother had never quite recovered from it, had in fact built an entire fragile architecture of hope around Wren finding happiness, as though one sibling's joy could somehow retroactively patch the hole the other had left. "She doesn't ask about my job anymore," Wren told me one night, staring into a mug of chamomile tea gone cold. "She doesn't ask about my apartment or my friends. She only asks if I'm seeing anyone. Every single phone call. Like she's checking a box that has to be checked before she's allowed to feel okay again." I remember not knowing what to say to that, so I just sat with her in the quiet, which I've learned is sometimes the only right response to someone else's grief, not fixing it, just witnessing it. The family gathering itself had been planned for months before it ever became relevant to me. Wren's mother, a warm and formidable woman named Linda Calloway, hosted an annual summer reunion at the family's lake house 2 hours outside the city, a tradition that had continued even after her son's death, though everyone privately understood it now carried a heavier weight than it used to. Wren had been dreading it for weeks, not because she didn't love her family, but because she knew exactly what awaited her, the aunts who would ask pointed questions about her love life over deviled eggs, the cousins who would compare their own engagements and babies like trophies, and her mother, who would spend the entire weekend watching Wren with that particular hungry hope in her eyes, the one that made Wren feel like a disappointment simply for being single and unremarkable and alive when her brother wasn't. "I could just not go," she said one evening, 3 weeks before the reunion, curled into the corner of our second-hand couch with her knees pulled to her chest. I could say I have a work thing. A wedding. Florists work weekends all the time, nobody would question it. But you want to go, I said, because I'd learned to read her well enough by then to know the difference between what she wanted and what she was afraid of. She was quiet for a long moment. I miss them. I miss my mom before she got like this. I miss the lake and the dumb volleyball tournament we do every year and my cousin's terrible potato salad. I just don't miss being the thing everyone's worried about. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said, you know what would actually be kind of funny? If I just showed up with someone. Just to get one summer where nobody asks. I laughed at the time, assuming it was just the kind of thing people say when they're tired and a little bit sad, the way you might joke about winning the lottery or moving to a cabin in the woods to escape your problems. I didn't think much more of it until 2 weeks later, when she brought it up again over breakfast, this time with a seriousness in her voice that hadn't been there before. I know this is insane, she said, turning her spoon over and over in her cereal bowl without eating any of it, but would you consider coming with me? As I don't even know what to call it. A +1. Just for the weekend. Just so my mom gets one summer of not looking at me like I'm broken. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. Part of me hesitated because it felt like a strange kind of lie, and I have never been someone comfortable with deception, even the well-intentioned kind. But a larger part of me looked at Wren's face, tired, hopeful, ashamed of her own hope, and understood that this wasn't really about deceiving her family. It was about giving a grieving mother a single weekend of relief from watching her surviving child suffer in the shadow of the one she'd lost. It was about giving Wren permission to just exist for 2 days without being cross-examined about her worthiness to be happy. So I said yes, with only one condition, that we tell them the truth eventually, whenever felt right, because I didn't want Linda Calloway building an entire hopeful narrative around something that would collapse the moment we stopped pretending. Wren agreed, relief flooding her face so completely that I felt, for the first time, the full weight of how much this had been costing her to carry alone. We spent the following week working out the details with the kind of meticulous, slightly absurd planning usually reserved for heist movies. We agreed on a story. We'd been together for 4 months, we'd met through a mutual friend from her old college roommate's engagement party. I worked in software and she'd bring up my job in a way that made me sound charmingly unremarkable rather than trying too hard to impress anyone. We practiced small physical affections that felt natural rather than performative, a hand on the small of the back, fingers laced together while walking, the kind of casual touch that real couples don't think about but fake ones have to choreograph. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most fun weeks Wren and I ever spent together, filled with laughter at how ridiculous the whole scheme was, and neither of us acknowledged, not even to ourselves, how easily some of that choreographed affection was starting to feel less like performance and more like something we simply liked doing. The drive to the lake house took just under 2 hours, winding through farmland that gradually gave way to pine forest and finally to the glittering expanse of Lake Adderley, ringed with modest cottages that had been in local families for generations. Wren grew quieter the closer we got, her hands twisting in her lap, and I reached over without thinking and covered them with mine, and she looked at me with something unreadable in her expression before exhaling and relaxing slightly into her seat. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly. "I know it's a lot to ask." "It's one weekend," I said. "And free lake house access. I think I'm getting the better end of this deal." She laughed, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders, and I remember feeling, in that moment, a strange and unfamiliar protectiveness toward her that had nothing to do with the fiction we were about to perform and everything to do with wanting, genuinely, to see her have one good weekend. The lake house itself was a sprawling, weathered structure with a wraparound porch and a dock that stretched out into water so clear you could see the smooth stones beneath it, and it was already crowded with Callaways by the time we arrived, aunts and uncles setting up folding tables, cousins chasing each other around the yard, someone's dog barking at the commotion. And there, standing at the top of the porch steps with her arms already open, was Linda Calloway, a woman whose face held both an aching sadness and a fierce, undimmed love, the kind you only see in people who have survived something that should have broken them and chose, instead, to keep loving harder. She came down the steps quickly, pulling Wren into an embrace that lasted several seconds longer than a casual hug, and then she turned to me, and that was the moment the hook landed, the moment she pulled me in two, tears already forming, and said the words that would define the entire weekend, and in some ways, the entire next chapter of my life. I am so glad she finally found someone who makes her laugh again. I felt Wren go rigid beside me for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, and I opened my mouth to say something, anything, some gentle clarification that wouldn't embarrass anyone, but Wren's hand found mine and squeezed, and she leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "Let's just let them keep thinking that," she whispered, and there was something in her voice, not manipulation, not even desperation, but a kind of exhausted tenderness, a plea from someone who had been carrying grief alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to just be allowed a moment of uncomplicated happiness. And so I smiled at Linda Calloway and said nothing to correct her, and just like that, the story that was supposed to last one carefully controlled weekend began to take on a life of its own. The first day unfolded with an ease that surprised me. Wren's family was loud and warm and chaotic in the particular way of families who have decided, collectively, to keep showing up for each other no matter what. Her cousin Theo, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh, immediately recruited me for the volleyball tournament, clapping me on the back and declaring that any man dating his cousin had better be able to serve. Her Aunt Patrice cornered me by the snack table and asked increasingly detailed questions about my intentions, which I answered with a mixture of honesty about my character and vague deflection about the future, threading a needle I hadn't expected to need. And Wren, for the first time since I'd met her, seemed to unclench. She laughed louder. She ate more than a few bites of her cousin's terrible potato salad, teasing him about the mayonnaise-to-potato ratio the way she must have when they were kids. She swam out to the raft anchored in the middle of the lake and floated on her back with her eyes closed, and when I swam out to join her, she reached over without opening her eyes and found my hand beneath the water, holding it loosely, and neither of us said anything about what that meant. It was on the dock that evening, as the sun began its long golden descent but hadn't yet dipped low enough to count as anything like nighttime, that Linda found a moment alone with me. She'd brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, handed me one, and settled onto the weathered wood beside me with the particular carefulness of a woman whose knees had started complaining a few years back. "I want to thank you," she said, watching the water rather than looking at me directly, which I would come to understand was how she approached most difficult conversations, as though the lake itself could absorb some of the weight of what she needed to say. "Wren hasn't laughed like this in years. Not since Caleb." Her son's name came out carefully, like something handled with gloves. I know grief isn't supposed to have a timeline, and I try to be patient, but I watch her carry it so quietly, like she thinks she's not allowed to take up space with her own pain because her brother isn't here to have his own. "And then you two showed up today, and for the first time in 4 years I looked at my daughter and saw someone who seemed unburdened. Even if just for an afternoon." She turned to me then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Whatever this is between you two, please be gentle with her. She deserves so much gentleness." I sat with that for a long moment, the lemonade sweating in my hand, and I felt the full weight of what we were doing settle onto my chest, not guilt exactly, but a profound awareness that this was no longer a harmless, victimless fiction. This was a mother's healing, however fragile and temporary, being built on a foundation that wasn't entirely true. And yet, looking out at Wren, who was down at the water's edge teaching her youngest cousin how to skip stones, laughing at his terrible aim, I couldn't bring myself to regret the decision, not yet. "I care about her a great deal," I told Linda, and that much, at least, was completely true. "I'll always try to be gentle with her." Linda nodded, satisfied, and patted my hand before rising to go check on the burgers, and I sat alone on the dock for a while longer, watching Wren laugh in the fading gold light, feeling something shift quietly inside my chest that I wasn't yet ready to name. The complications began the following morning, as complications in stories like this one always seem to, with the arrival of someone unexpected. Wren's cousin Delphine, who had missed the first day due to a delayed flight, showed up just before breakfast with her fiancé in tow, and within minutes of arriving, she'd cornered Wren in the kitchen with the bright, invasive curiosity of someone who hadn't yet absorbed the family's unspoken agreement to tread carefully around Wren's love life. "So this is the famous boyfriend," Delphine said, eyeing me across the kitchen island as I helped Wren's uncle flip pancakes. "Mom told me everything. 4 months, right? How'd you two meet again?" And it was in the small hesitation before Wren answered, a fraction of a second too long, a flicker of panic behind her eyes, that I understood how precarious our fiction actually was, how easily one inconsistent detail could unravel the whole thing and, worse, hurt the people we were trying to protect. "Mutual friend," I said smoothly, stepping in before Wren had to. "Piper, from her old building. We hit it off at her engagement party. If you can believe getting together at someone else's engagement party isn't the world's most obvious cliché." I delivered the line with just enough self-deprecating humor that Delphine laughed and moved on to asking about the wedding she was planning instead, and I felt Wren exhale beside me, her shoulder brushing mine in silent thanks. But later, when we found a moment alone by the woodpile, ostensibly gathering kindling for the evening's bonfire, she turned to me with something troubled in her expression. "This is getting complicated," she said quietly. "I didn't think it through. I just wanted one weekend, and now I'm watching you build an entire relationship history on the fly and I feel sick about it, Grant. I feel like I've dragged you into something that isn't fair to you." I said yes, I reminded her. "Nobody dragged me anywhere. You said yes to protecting my mom's feelings for one dinner," she said. "Not to spending an entire weekend constructing a fake love story that apparently now includes a meet-cute at my roommate's engagement party." She sat down heavily on an overturned log, running her hands through her hair. "I keep thinking about what happens Monday. We drive home, we go back to being roommates, and I have to call my mother in a few weeks and somehow explain that we broke up, and she's going to be devastated all over again, and it'll be worse than if we'd never done this at all, because now she'll have gotten a taste of what she's been hoping for and lost it." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I understood then that this wasn't really about the logistics of maintaining a lie. It was about the fear underneath it, the fear that she was, in some fundamental way, always destined to disappoint the people who loved her most, that even her attempts to give her mother a moment of peace were doomed to end in more grief. I sat down beside her on the log, close enough that our shoulders touched, and I didn't say anything for a while, because I'd learned by then that Wren didn't need immediate solutions as much as she needed someone willing to sit in the discomfort with her. "Can I tell you something," I finally said, "that I haven't fully admitted to myself until about 10 minutes ago?" She looked up at me, waiting. "I don't think I've been pretending as much as you think I have." The words surprised me even as I said them, but once they were out, I realized how true they'd been for longer than I wanted to admit, in the way I reached for her hand without thinking, in the warmth that spread through my chest every time she laughed at something I said, in the quiet contentment I felt simply being near her these past 2 days, fiction or not. "I don't know what this is yet. But I don't think all of it has been fake." Wren went very still beside me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the only sound the distant shrieks of children playing in the lake and the crackle of the woodpile settling under my hands. "I don't want to say something because I'm scared and this weekend has been emotionally overwhelming and I don't want to make a mistake I can't take back," she finally said, carefully, the way she might describe handling a fragile stem in her shop. "But I don't think I've been pretending either. Not for a while." It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, not fully, it was something smaller and more honest than that, a mutual acknowledgement that something real had grown quietly in the space where a fiction was supposed to live, the way wildflowers sometimes take root in the cracks of an old sidewalk, uninvited but undeniable. We didn't resolve anything that afternoon, not in any dramatic way. We gathered the kindling and returned to the house and spent the rest of the day the way you spend the rest of any family reunion day, badly losing at cornhole, eating too much watermelon, listening to Wren's uncle tell the same fishing story he apparently told every single year with embellishments that grew more elaborate with each telling. But something had shifted between us, a quiet undercurrent that neither of us named but both of us felt, in the way our hands found each other more often, in the way Wren leaned her head against my shoulder during the evening slideshow of old family photos without any audience to perform for, in the way I found myself watching her across the yard simply because I wanted to, not because the role required it. It was during that slideshow, projected onto a bedsheet hung between two trees as the sun finally began its true descent toward the horizon, that the deepest layer of this story revealed itself. Linda had put together a compilation of family photos spanning decades, and about 2/3 of the way through, a photo of a young man appeared, tall, dark-haired, with Wren's same easy smile, standing on the very dock we'd been sitting on the night before, mid-laugh, arms slung around a teenage Wren's shoulders. The yard went quiet. This was Caleb, I understood immediately, and I felt Wren's hand tighten in mine as more photos followed, a montage of a life that had ended too early, Caleb graduating high school, Caleb at his first job, Caleb holding a baby cousin who was now nearly a teenager herself, and finally, a photo taken just weeks before the accident, Caleb and Wren sitting together on porch steps, heads tilted toward each other, clearly mid-conversation, clearly close in the particular way siblings sometimes are. When the age gap between them has stopped mattering and they've simply become friends. Linda's voice, when she spoke, was thick with tears she didn't try to hide. Caleb used to say that Wren was the bravest person he knew, she told the assembled family, her eyes finding her daughter across the yard. He used to say she felt everything so deeply that it scared him, but that it was also the thing he admired most about her. I think about that a lot. How brave it is to keep feeling things deeply, even after they hurt you. Even after you lose someone. She wiped her eyes and managed a small, wavering smile. I'm just so grateful that this year, when I look at my daughter, I see someone who's let herself feel joy again. That matters more to me than I think I've ever told you, sweetheart. She was looking directly at Wren now, and Wren was crying too, silent tears streaking down her face, and I felt the full magnitude of the deception we'd constructed pressing down on my chest like a physical weight, because this wasn't a small white lie anymore. This was a mother finding a fragile, precious foothold of hope after 4 years of grief, built partly on something that hadn't been entirely true when the weekend began. I want to pause here and ask you something. If this story has moved you at all so far, what would you have done in my place? I think about that question a lot, even now, months later. Would you have let the lie continue for the sake of one grieving mother's peace? Or would you have found the truth, however painful, to be the only path that respected everyone involved? I don't think there's a clean answer, and I don't think this story would be worth telling if there were. If you have an answer of your own, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments below, because stories like this one only become richer when we sit with their difficult questions together as a community rather than rushing past them toward easy resolutions. That night, and I promise this is the only necessary departure from daylight in this whole story, because what happened needs the particular privacy that only darkness provides, Wren and I sat on the end of the dock long after everyone else had gone to bed, the lake house behind us gone quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas and the soft lapping of water against the pilings. Wren had her knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the black expanse of water reflecting a scatter of stars, and she was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. I've never told anyone this, she said, but I used to think it should have been me. In the car, I mean. Caleb was driving to pick me up from the airport that night. If my flight hadn't been delayed, if I'd just taken the later connection like I originally planned, he wouldn't have been on that road at that hour. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the years of carrying this particular weight in it, the way certain grief calcifies into guilt if it's never spoken aloud. I've never said that to my mom. I don't think I ever will. But it's why I can't stand it when she looks at me like I'm the thing that's supposed to fix her sadness. Because some days I think I'm the reason for it. I didn't try to argue her out of the feeling, because I understood by then that grief like hers doesn't respond to logic, only to being witnessed without judgment. That's not true, I said quietly, but I know knowing that doesn't make it feel less true when you're the one carrying it. I reached over and took her hand, and she let me, her fingers cold from the night air. I think your mom doesn't need you to fix her grief. I think she just needs to know you're still here, and still capable of joy, because that's proof that grief doesn't have to be the only thing left after loss. That's not pressure. That's just love, looking for evidence that it's not the last thing standing. Wren turned to look at me then, her eyes searching mine in the dim light, and something passed between us that neither performance nor pretense could have manufactured, something that had been quietly building for 8 months of shared coffee mornings and terrible television, and now, this strange, complicated weekend that had cracked something open in both of us. I don't want this weekend to end, she admitted softly. And I don't just mean because of my mom. Then maybe it doesn't have to, I said, and I meant it as more than a comment about the reunion. I meant it as an offer, tentative and real, and Wren seemed to understand that, because she leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long while, not talking, just letting the truth settle between us in the quiet dark before we returned, eventually, to the house and to separate rooms, because some things, even true things, deserve to unfold slowly rather than being rushed toward a conclusion neither of us was ready to name aloud in the middle of someone else's family reunion. The final day of the reunion brought the reckoning I'd known was coming since Linda's speech at the slideshow, though it arrived in a form gentler than I'd feared. It was Linda herself who created the opening, finding Wren alone on the porch swing early that morning while most of the family was still asleep, and I happened to be close enough, refilling my coffee in the kitchen with the window cracked, to hear the conversation that followed, though I want to be clear I wasn't eavesdropping so much as simply present, unable to remove myself without drawing attention. "You've been different this weekend," Linda said to her daughter, settling onto the swing beside her. "Lighter. I keep trying to figure out if it's Grant, or if it's something else. Maybe both." She paused. "I need you to know that whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm not going to fall apart if it doesn't work out. I know I've put a weight on you these past few years. I know every phone call probably felt like an interrogation. I've been so scared of losing you to grief the way I lost Caleb to that road that I forgot grief doesn't work like that. You can't love someone into being okay. I should have learned that by now." There was a long pause, and I could picture Wren beside her, working up the courage for what came next, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor that told me exactly how much this cost her. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Another pause, longer this time. "Grant and I aren't actually together. Not the way you think. We're roommates. I asked him to come this weekend because I couldn't face one more reunion where everyone watched me like I was a wound that hadn't healed right, and I panicked, and it turned into this whole thing, and I am so sorry, because I watched your face at the slideshow last night and I know what that meant to you, and I built it on something that wasn't true." Her voice broke on the last words. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted one weekend where I wasn't the sad daughter." I set my coffee mug down very carefully, my heart pounding, uncertain whether to go out there or give them privacy, and in the silence that followed, I heard something I hadn't expected, Linda, laughing, softly at first and then more fully, a sound that carried relief rather than anger. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice even through the window. "I've known since about 10 minutes after you two walked in the door." Wren made a small, startled sound, and Linda continued, gently. "You've never once looked at a boyfriend the way you looked at him, hon. Real couples don't check in with each other before every single sentence like they're worried about getting the details wrong. But I watched you two anyway, all weekend, and I'll tell you what I actually saw, which is that even if it started as something made up, it stopped being made up somewhere around yesterday afternoon. I saw the way he looked at you when you weren't watching. I saw the way you leaned into him without thinking about it. Whatever this was when you started it, it's not what it is now. Am I wrong?" There was a silence long enough that I found myself holding my breath in the kitchen, waiting, and then Wren's voice, small and honest in a way I'd never quite heard it before. "No," she said. "You're not wrong." Linda made a soft, satisfied sound, and I heard the porch swing creak as she pulled her daughter into her arms. "Then here's what I need you to understand," Linda said, her voice thick again, though this time with something gentler than grief. I didn't spend this weekend hoping you'd found a boyfriend, Wren. I spent it hoping you'd found a reason to let yourself be happy again, whatever shape that took. That's what mattered. Not the details. Just watching you laugh like you used to. That was never about him proving anything to me. That was about you finally giving yourself permission. She paused, and when she spoke again, there was a wry note in her voice that reminded me powerfully of Wren. Though for the record, I would like you to actually date him properly now, because I've already told your Aunt Patrice he's a keeper, and I am not walking that back. I stepped away from the window then, giving them the rest of the moment in privacy, my chest full of something I didn't quite have words for yet, relief, certainly, but also a tenderness that had been building all weekend and now had nowhere left to hide, no fiction left to shelter behind. When Wren found me later that morning, down by the water, her eyes still red-rimmed from crying but her face lighter than I'd seen it in the entire 8 months I'd known her, she didn't say anything at first. She just walked up beside me, took my hand, and stood there looking out at the lake, and after a while she said, "So. My mom knows. And apparently she's already decided you're staying. Is that all right with you?" I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not a formality, because everything that had happened over the past 3 days deserved to be chosen deliberately rather than assumed. Wren turned to face me fully then, and there was something clear-eyed and certain in her expression that hadn't been there before, the particular certainty that comes from finally setting down a weight you've been carrying alone for far too long. "I think it's more than all right," she said. "I think I've been scared of wanting this for a long time, because wanting things felt like tempting fate after Caleb. Like if I let myself be happy, something would come along and take it away, the way it took him. But watching my mom just now, hearing her say that she just wanted to see me happy, whatever shape that took," she paused, gathering herself. "I think I've been so busy protecting everyone else from my grief that I forgot I'm allowed to just live. I'm allowed to want this. I want this, Grant. I want you. Not as a favor. Not as a performance for my family. Just because it's true." I kissed her then, on the dock where 3 days earlier we'd held hands beneath the water as nothing more than roommates on a strange favor, and it felt, in that moment, less like the beginning of something new and more like the honest culmination of something that had been quietly growing since the very first day she'd opened her apartment door and told me I didn't seem like a serial killer. Behind us, unbeknownst to either of us until later, half the family had gathered at the kitchen window to watch, and Theo would later claim he'd started a betting pool weeks earlier on exactly this outcome, which Wren found both mortifying and, eventually, hilarious. The rest of that final day passed in the particular golden glow that follows an emotional storm finally breaking into clear weather. Linda insisted on an encore volleyball match, this time openly rooting for Wren and me as a real team rather than one built on pretense, and we lost badly and didn't care at all. Patrice cornered me again by the snack table, this time to inform me with great seriousness that she expected an invitation to whatever came next, whatever that might be, and I promised her she'd have one. And that evening, before we packed up to drive home, Linda pulled me aside one more time, her expression softer and more open than it had been even on the dock the night before. "I know this weekend started as something complicated," she said. "But I want you to know that whatever you two decide to build from here, you already gave me something I didn't think I'd get back. I got to watch my daughter come alive again. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually." She hugged me then, a real hug this time, free of the fragile hope that had colored our first embrace, replaced instead with something sturdier, gratitude, maybe, or the particular relief of a mother whose worst fears had, for once, not come true. The drive home was quieter than the drive there had been, but it was the comfortable kind of quiet, filled with occasional laughter as we replayed the weekend's more absurd moments, Theo's betting pool, Patrice's interrogations, the potato salad that truly was terrible. Somewhere along that familiar highway, Wren reached over and laced her fingers through mine, not as choreography this time, not as performance for anyone watching, but simply because she wanted to, and I understood that whatever fragile, complicated fiction we'd built to survive one family reunion had somewhere along the way become something entirely real, something neither of us had planned for but both of us, if we were honest, had perhaps been hoping for all along without daring to say so out loud. In the months that followed, our relationship grew the way real ones do, slowly, imperfectly, full of the ordinary friction of two people learning each other in a new way after already knowing each other so well in an old one. We had our first real fight over something small and stupid, about whose turn it was to do the dishes, made larger by both of us not yet knowing how to navigate conflict as something more than roommates. We learned to apologize to each other in the specific ways we each needed, Wren with words, me with actions. We visited Linda again in the fall, this time with no pretense at all, and I watched Wren tell her mother, unprompted, about the guilt she'd carried for 4 years about Caleb's accident, and I watched Linda hold her daughter and tell her, with a fierceness that left no room for doubt, that it had never once been her fault, that grief lies to us in the cruelest ways imaginable, and that healing sometimes means learning to stop believing every lie it tells. Wren cried for a long time that day, but it was the kind of crying that clears something out rather than the kind that just adds more weight, and when she finally lifted her head, there was a lightness in her I hadn't seen before, not even during the best moments of the reunion. We got married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the very lake house where the whole complicated, beautiful mess had begun, with flowers Wren arranged herself, the same eucalyptus and rose stems that always seemed to cling faintly to her fingers even months after leaving the shop. Linda stood at the front during the ceremony, and when the officiant asked if anyone wished to say a few words, she rose without hesitation and spoke about her son, about the particular bravery it takes to keep loving fully after loss has taught you how much it costs, and about watching her daughter, over the span of one strange and unexpected weekend, remember how to be brave in exactly that way. There wasn't a dry eye at that lake by the time she finished, including mine. If this story touched something in you, if you believe, the way Wren and Linda and I have all come to believe, in second chances and the strange, quiet grace that can grow out of even our most complicated choices, in kindness that doesn't ask for anything in return, in the particular courage it takes to keep loving after grief has tried to convince you love isn't safe anymore, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you're here for the next story we tell. Before I go, I'd love to know, what's one moment in your own life where a small act of kindness, or even a small, well-meaning fib, ended up leading you somewhere far more meaningful than you ever expected? I read every comment, and I think this particular story deserves to keep growing in the stories you share back with us. These days, 4 years into a marriage that began as an accidental favor between roommates, Wren still keeps a single framed photograph on our bedroom dresser, not of our wedding day, though we have plenty of those, but of the two of us on that dock at Lake Adderley, taken by her cousin Theo just moments after that first kiss, both of us laughing at something neither of us can quite remember anymore, caught mid-transformation from a fiction we'd built to protect someone we loved into a truth we hadn't yet found the courage to name. Linda calls every Sunday now, and her questions have changed. She asks about the garden we're building in our new backyard, about Wren's shop, which has grown enough that she's hired her first employee, about the trip we're planning for our anniversary. She doesn't ask if we're happy anymore, because she doesn't need to. She can simply hear it, every single time, in the easy, unguarded sound of her daughter's laughter on the other end of the line, proof, if any more was ever needed, that sometimes the truest things in our lives begin as the smallest, most improbable acts of kindness, whispered quietly between two people who were only ever trying to protect the people they loved, and ended up, without either of them quite realizing it, falling in love with each other along the way.